Welcome back to Everard Junction. In today's video we're going to be doing a layout update. I've been working on various little projects all over the layout over the past couple of months, so I think it'd probably be a good idea to show you a couple of those, and I've also made a few changes and improvements to existing areas that you've seen previously. So to kick things off, one of the little jobs that I've been doing over the past month or so has been to add lighting to the block of flats and shops that overlook the station. I've done all the lighting to the waiting room, the car park and the station building and the canopy and so on, but you had these buildings in the background that were just dark, and it really sort of let the scene down, and I knew lighting them was going to look really good. It was going to really help sort of sell this scene when the main lights are turned off in the room, but it was going to be an absolute pain to fit lighting due to the size of the building and the various floors and so on. So as you can see, I have now completed fitting the lights. I've used surface mount LEDs, and then I've added relevant resistors to tone those down, give a nice sort of gloomy look to things so it matches the rest of what's going on in this area. And as you can see, there's different colour temperatures for different rooms on the building, which just sort of give a little bit of variation, a little bit of variety. If you look over at this building here, you can see all the windows, the sort of light coming out of them is the same colour. That's still a work in progress for this big building over here, but I've done a few bits of experimentation on the block of flats, and you can see how some of the rooms are sort of lighter in colour temperature than the others. I've also added lighting to the communal walkway. That looks especially dark and dodgy and unpleasant, which is just what I was going for. And as you can see, a couple of bulbs are not working in certain sections of the communal walkway, which is of course deliberate, as it would be unlikely for them to all be working. And hopefully you can see there how the colour temperature of the various lights in the flats complement the waiting room on the station platform and the car park lighting. It's got a nice level of gloom to the scene, but it still has a bit of, a bit of character, a bit of personality, and I'm quite pleased with the sort of balance I've managed to strike here. While I'm trying to portray an urban built-up area that's a little bit run down, I don't want it to look really depressing, so I'm trying to sort of strike a sort of line down the middle and have a few things to nod to what life was like back then in certain places, but also, keep things looking somewhat pleasing and fun, as it is a model railway. So far, the LEDs that I've been using to complete these lighting projects has been predominantly these surface mount LEDs that I bought from eBay. You can see they come on a small sort of circuit board with some wires pre-soldered, so they're just a little bit easier in terms of installation. The resistor that comes with them still leaves a relatively bright light when hooked up to 12 volts DC, which is what I'm using to power all of this. So I add an additional resistor of various values to the wiring loom to just tone the brightness to my liking. These particular LEDs are warm white, so they look quite good straight out of the box, but just to give them that sort of gloomy 80s feel, I'm going over some of them with the Tamiya X26 clear orange, and that just provides a nice tint and gives that sort of old school feel to the lighting. In some cases I'm leaving the lights completely alone. Other cases I'll come along with a paintbrush and just do a very quick, just a little blob of orange on the light, and if I want some of them to really sort of look quite gloomy and orange, then I'll do maybe 2 or 3 coats. So by building up coats of the X26 clear orange, you can alter the colour temperature of the LED, and then that really complements things when they're installed in a large structure like that block of flats. Each floor inside the flats is lit with an LED. What I've done is to certain windows fitted a piece of card painted matte black to completely block out any light coming through that window, and that gives the effect of some rooms, in complete darkness with the lights switched off. The lighting on this structure is still a work in progress. You can see the canopy lighting is really quite garish and quite bright, so I'll be toning that down, and I'd like to sort of adjust the colour temperature of the LEDs that are in the block of offices themselves, give some variation, and also give an element of that sort of old school fluorescent tube and sodium lighting that was commonplace during the 1980s. The flats themselves are of course still a work in progress. I've done a couple of little bits and pieces here and there, but nothing too major, and hopefully you can see there just at a casual glance with the lights on in the room how it's basically impossible to tell which windows are completely blanked off with black card and which ones you can see through into the building. So the building seems to work quite well both in daylight and in darkness, with a sort of realistic portrayal in both cases. Up on the roof of the building I've added a small amount of moss and lichen, so just a couple of places, just using some Woodland Scenic's fine scatter, a couple of different colours there mixed up in varying amounts, and that just, you know, breaks things up a little bit on the roof. I've still got extra details to add up here and extra weathering and things like that. I've also got some pigeons and things to add to the railings, as there probably would be quite a few sitting on that in real life. Around the front of the building on the street you can see it's still very much a work in progress once again. The windows here are still yet to be blanked off in different places, so at the moment this entire side of the structure is illuminated, so it looks a bit garish on its own, but when I get around to detailing this little street scene that I plan for up here, then we'll finish off doing the shop frontage and blank out various windows upstairs, just to give it that sort of more authentic feel. In terms of interiors, the windows on this building are quite small and it's difficult to see inside. It would also take me an extremely long time to construct interiors for all 9 of the sort of individual cells, if you like, that the building is made out of. But I'll be doing a few bits and pieces where, you know, you can see stuff. So we'll be doing a few bits to sort of sell the illusion that there's perhaps an interior in this building. But I'm certainly not going to be going down the road of getting loads of 3D printed stuff and spending a load of time detailing the buildings, as the windows are very small and it's difficult to see inside. I think my time could be better used elsewhere. Quick shout out to Buddy Dave over at Dean Park Station. He's doing another one of his Christmas competitions this year, and he's managed to get himself quite an array of stuff to give away. The prizes range from the newly tooled Bachmann Class 24, one of Rapido's lovely model buses, Acura-scale HDA hoppers, various wagons from the likes of EFE Rail and Bachmann, and scenic accessories from the likes of display scale models and scale model scenery. I know it took Dave a very long time to set all of this up and get the video produced, so it would mean a great deal to him if you could check out his little competition. It costs nothing, of course, to enter, and you've certainly got significantly more odds of winning something than you have with the likes of the National Lottery. There's a link in the description if you're interested. The closing date for the competition is Tuesday, the 20th of December 2022, with the draw being made on the 23rd. Over here on the car park scene, which was the focus for the previous video, I've continued to work on it, add little details here and there. You can see I've added the rest of the bollards, which I ran out of in the previous video, and I've just generally tweaked things and continued to add detail and tailor the scene to my liking. The most pressing job that needed to be done to this scene was to add a nice fascia board to the front of the layout, so you couldn't see all of the nasty Celotex foam in various layers underneath the car park scene and the baseboards and bits and pieces that make up the structure of the layout itself. I've got a nice piece of birch ply on there as per the rest of the layout, and it just helps frame things off nicely and it looks nice and clean and somewhat professional. That's really given this scene a nice lift in its appearance, as general viewing distance is something about here. Obviously most of the shots on the layout are getting really close and we look really in a great deal of detail to various small items and scenes, but the reality of a model railway like this is pretty much most of the time you're going to see it like this from a few feet away. So you're always going to have that nasty bit of baseboard in your peripheral vision, so it was important for me to get this installed as soon as possible. As you can see, I've also extended the scenery onto the top of said fascia board, and that just again helps make things look a little bit tidier and a bit more professional. There are still some rough edges here and there, such as to the left of the camera. You can see it looks a little bit dodgy here where this bit of brick wall is, something I just need to get round to sorting out. I haven't quite had enough time for it yet. In terms of detail to the scene, I've continued to add little bits of greenery and shrubs and things here and there, with various bits of foliage growing up between the paving slabs. That was a popular comment on the previous video, and it was always something I intended on adding to the scene in a similar manner to the town scene around the corner by the canal that I built previously. I've also added a few more figures to the scene just to inject a little bit more life, and as I said in the previous video, these are 3D printed with the exception of 1 or 2 that have just been rattling around in my collection, but most of them are 3D printed and they're made by fine scale figures. Very nice, take a long time to paint, very intricate, very detailed, very delicate, so it can be a bit tricky to paint some of them, but if you've got the eye for it and the steady hand, it's well worth it, and it's quite relaxing sometimes to just spend an evening, just listen to some music and just paint a couple of figures up. I've also continued to add graffiti tags in a few more places and a little bit of weathering here and there where I'd missed it previously. I've also added some more litter, particularly newspapers from the scale model scenery litter sheet, and you can see around this geyser leaning up against the brick wall we've got a few newspapers and stuff, and I've sort of weathered those and just sort of toned them down a little bit, and you can see how some of that foliage just coming up between the joints in the paving slabs just helps sort of sell the scene, make it look still relatively new. I'm going for a somewhat refurbished station, but let's say it was 5-6 years old, so you're going to start seeing a few things creeping through. The main change I've made to this scene is the pavement. So what I decided to do was take the pavement up and have another go at it using a different technique and some extra colours and paints and things to try and get a more varied tone and a more weathered finish. So instead of cutting the paving slabs out of 2mm card, instead what I've done is cut them out of plastic, and the Cricut machine has certainly done a much nicer job of doing that. When it comes to painting them, I basically laid all the slabs out and I painted, I think, 3 different colours. So I had a group of slabs that I painted one sort of shade of grey, then another group of slabs that I painted a more sort of brown colour, and I basically painted 3 different colours on multiple slabs, mixed them all up into a pot, and then when I laid the pavement we got a really random assortment of colours. So you can see how some of the paving slabs look a little bit more brown than others, and it just adds a nice level of variation, I think, to the scene. And you can see, being plastic, where I've glued them down to another smooth piece of plastic as a base layer underneath, you can see it's much more level, but there are still a few places where 1 or 2 are perhaps slightly lifted, but only very slightly by, say, 0.1, 0.2 of a millimetre, which in scale looks a little bit more convincing. So it's still a somewhat uneven pavement, but it looks a lot finer, I think, with this particular go. You can see there's still a few things I need to tidy up, like that little bit of curbstone just there, but overall I'm really pleased with the new pavement. To apply weathering to the pavement after I've glued everything down, I've used the Tamiya Weathering Master. This is my sort of go-to set for weathering buildings and structures and scenery on the layout. I've got set A and set B, and I find these to be a sort of nice mix of various grimy colours for doing model railways. So hopefully you can make out there the weathering powder on the pavement. It's in varying amounts, and I've just done that with a soft paintbrush and a few cotton buds. It just gives that little bit of age, bit of use, bit of distress to the paving, but it still looks relatively new and not on the scrap heap. I don't want this station to look dreadful. I want to, make it look fun and give it some character and stuff like that, and have a nod, to what some rundown places did look like 30 odd years ago. And of course, to do that, as I always do, I work extensively from photographs from the period, and I think I've got relatively close to some of the more fresh Network South East stations that were starting to pop up in the late 80s and early 90s. Another thing I've done is add a drop curb into the pavement when I relaid it, as you would want some sort of drop curb to get up from the car park into the station. I thought just behind the bike shed would probably be an appropriate place, as it's facing the stairs to get into the station building. So with the drop curb and the disabled access ramp and 1 or 2 handrails here and there, as well as the placement of various bollards around the station building, I think I've got a nice balance there. I am modelling the scene as it was 30 odd years ago. Most of the pictures I've looked at of regional Network South East stations, you'd be lucky if you had a car park, let alone anywhere to put your bike. The consideration to health and safety, disabled access, trip hazards, what's a hazard, what's not, what's acceptable, what isn't, all that modern stuff that we obsess over today just didn't exist back then. You would be lucky to find a disabled spot at your local supermarket, let alone the railway station. I've brought the waiting room a little bit closer to completion, and to do that what I've done is add an interior to the waiting section of this building, and that's including a couple of figures, a few 3D printed chairs from model railway scenes, all sprayed Network South East red, and there's a few adverts and things hanging on the wall. As you can see from this side, from the car park side, it's impossible to see any of that, but it is present, and if we take a look at this picture, you can see there's a couple of figures just there at the window, and there are a few chairs and things like that inside the station, and it just helps give it that sort of bit of life, bit of something going on, and that's the kind of thing I want to sort of extend out onto the rest of the station area. Out on the platforms, something I really wanted to include on the station, especially being Network South East and of the late 1980s just into 1990 for the time period, was the classic British Rail cheese grater seat. Now, these are still found on the network. They were absolutely everywhere, painted various colours, and I remember sitting on these as a child at various stations up and down the country back in the 90s and the early 2000s. A real sort of prominent piece of design with regards to station furniture, and instantly recognisable, and most people will recognise one of these when they see them. These particular ones are made by Scale Model Scenery. I've purchased several packs of these and sprayed them all up to put on the station. They are extremely delicate and extremely fragile. As you can see, you can basically see through the seat. You know, it's got that authentic sort of appearance to the seat base and seat back. And as a result of that, obviously, these are extremely delicate, very flimsy and easily broken. In an effort to get these to last several years, hopefully I won't damage too many of them, but as I say, they are very fragile. What I've done is glue a little bit of brass rod, gives the seat an extra bit of rigidity, stops it sagging over time, and if it does get knocked or moved around while I'm building things in a similar spot, hopefully it will give it a bit of extra defence and stop it from breaking. If you do get some of these, I recommend that it's probably a good idea to add some sort of bracing similar to that underneath the seat, just to give it an extra bit of strength, as they are very easily damaged. Another project that's getting a little bit closer to completion is something that I basically work on constantly year round. I've always got one or two on the go, and that is cars for the layout.
Are you looking for a great deal on a quality used second-hand car?
I'm a big fan of classic cars. I work in classic car repair as a job, so I'm always into sort of doing stuff with the various models of cars on the layout. And something that I've done for the car park here is a little bit of weathering, a little bit of toning down, and I've also made some modifications to some of the cars to make them look a little bit more authentic for the sort of era and region that I'm trying to model. So very briefly, the cars on the layout are 1/76 scale, so I model British 00 scale, that's 1/76 scale, so all the cars obviously need to be 1/76 scale. HO scale cars, 1/87 scale cars look a bit too small, it doesn't really work, so us British modelers modelling 00, we need to buy 1/76 scale vehicles. The 00 market for cars in the UK is pretty much dominated by Oxford Diecast. They pretty much run the show, and they make an extensive range of various vehicles that are appropriate for a great many layouts. So one of the problems with all these cars from Oxford Diecast is obviously to sell as many model cars as possible. What they tend to gravitate towards is the more exciting, sporty models of the various cars. So you can see we've got the Escort, but it's the XR3i, the hot, sporty version. We've got the Astra, but it's the Astra GTE. We've got the Audi Quattro instead of the Audi Coupe. We've got the Ford Sierra Sapphire Cosworth instead of just an ordinary Ford Sierra. And even the Rover SD1 is the fuel-injected Vitesse model with the big chin spoiler and the rear spoiler. All of these parked together in the same spot can look a bit strange. So in addition to my usual weathering and aging to the various model vehicles, what I've started to do more recently is adapt some of these die-cast models to portray the more basic, mundane versions of the same car, just to make the railway look a little bit more authentic for the time period, a bit more typical, as I don't want everything to be GTI parked everywhere.
The highly advanced Austin Maestro from 4,750 pounds. Driving is believing.
So here we have the Ford Escort XR3i, a car that rusted so poorly that eventually the battery was likely to fall through the bulkhead and end up in the glove box, and the Astra GTE that also rusted as quickly, with the benefit of understeering catastrophically into the nearest tree. So what I've done to those two sporty models is tone things down considerably, and instead of an XR3, we now have a 1.1 Popular, finished in white, and it doesn't even come with a sunroof. And with the Vauxhall, we have a similarly equipped base model Astra. So with a bit of work, what I've managed to do is remove the spoiler from the XR3 and fill in the holes left behind from that spoiler. I've also filled in the hole for the sunroof and filed all that smooth. I've filed off the metal that portrays the slight body kit that the XR3 had to convert it to a more sort of ordinary, mundane Ford Escort. And on the right with the Astra, again, I've removed the spoiler. That's die cast as part of the body shell, so that took a reasonable bit of filing to get rid of that. But with that deleted, I've then also gone over the bonnet vents with a little bit of filler, and I've removed those bonnet vents, and you can see now it just looks like an ordinary two-door Astra. And there you can see with a little bit of paint, some satin varnish and some subtle weathering here and there, we now have two extremely ordinary looking vehicles that blend in much better with the layout and what I'm trying to do. As you can see, the bloke on the left forked out the extra £30 for a sunroof, but other than that, very low spec cars. I've also filled in the wheels, so it just looks like it's got a set of rubbish wheel trims on it rather than a nice set of alloys. So following on with that theme, I've just continued to add detail and modify various cars where they've needed it. So a good example here is this two-tone Ford Sierra. This was the Cosworth, and now it's just a saloon, just an ordinary saloon. As you can see, I've removed the spoiler and I've painted it in that sort of two-tone colour that was quite common on Sierras back in the day, with the lower body being finished in a sort of gunmetal colour.
There is only one Ford Sierra.
A light weathering and a coat of satin varnish, and that pretty much completes the car. These would have been relatively new at the time. A pair of tatty Ford Escorts, Mark 1 and Mark 2. These in the 80s were 50 quid a go, and you basically used them until they exploded and then went and got another one.
Whoa! You drove like that on a public highway, you deserve to be called a raving maniac!
On both of these, I've done some weathering to give a bit of age and distress, particularly on the green Mark 1 Escort, and I've also added mirrors and wipers. As you can see on the Mark 1 Escort just there, we've got some typical sort of Trico sort of looking chrome wipers that they typically sort of had back in the day. It's only got one mirror. Again, that was common. You tended to only get a mirror on the driver's side unless you explicitly ordered one for the passenger side. And you can see how the front bumper has started to rust out on the corners, and the car's generally looking a bit sorry for itself. The same goes for the Mark II Escort, albeit not quite as badly as it was slightly newer. Here we have a Mini 1275 GT, and you can see I've repainted the door deliberately the wrong shade of red just to give it that sort of used appearance. Again, a typical sight back in the day. A Mark II Cavalier. This is just a colour change. The various vehicles offered from Oxford are only available in certain colours, so I decided to paint this one blue just so it looks a little bit different to the typical sort of maroon one that most people have got on their layouts. A panel line wash, some satin varnish and a subtle weathering, but nothing too crazy. This car wouldn't have been terribly old by the time the layout is set.
It's still a jump ahead of its rivals. The new fuel-injected Vauxhall Cavaliers. Fly one soon.
A Range Rover Classic, specifically an earlier two-door variety. I have the pleasure of working on these in my day job, and certainly no stranger to welding them up. They really do rust like hell, certainly from the inside out. I've done the typical sort of thing. The bonnet is rotten all the way around the edge, basically where it meets the shell of the vehicle, and at the back of the Range Rover around the rear light you have this little panel, and I've put a load of rust around that as well, as that's another very typical rust spot, and I've repaired quite a few of those. The rest of the panels on the Range Rover are made of aluminium, so outwardly they can typically look quite respectable, but it's when you dig inside they look a right mess. So I haven't put too much rust and corrosion on the outside of the Range Rover, as they tend to hide it quite well. Mostly the areas that are made of mild steel, the bonnet, and the little buckets that take the rear lights. Other stuff is aluminium and doesn't outwardly show serious corrosion. Although I can assure you on some of them, a slight breeze and pretty much the whole car would disassemble itself. Here we have something a little bit different. As I said, the market is basically dominated by Oxford diecast, but there are a few alternatives available. I keep my eyes peeled on eBay and places to try and find some of this stuff, but it can be a bit tricky to find. So a big thanks to Martin on Instagram, who pointed me in the direction of this 3D printed Ford Granada, specifically the Mark II variant, and an absolute perfect fit for the layout. These were everywhere in the 1980s.
You'll never believe how good the new Granada is until you drive it.
As several of you know, I'm a big fan of the Ford Granada, owning an example myself, so it was only fitting that I should pick this up. I'll put the link to this in the video description. I have no affiliation at all other than being a satisfied customer. This is a 3D print and it does require a bit of work to get the best out of it, including having to make your own glazing. I've done the best I can with it and I'm quite happy with the results. These did rust, but in typical style for Fords from the era, they rusted in places that were difficult to see and could outwardly look quite respectable long after they shouldn't be on the road. So it doesn't look absolutely dreadful, but underneath it probably is, and I can assure you of that, having fixed several of them over the last few years. I've done the best I can with the glazing, using some clear plastic to make it happen. It is very difficult and the car is tiny. We're talking 1/76 scale, so a lot of this stuff is very, very small. I've added some mirrors and some very fine bits of wires to represent the wipers, and then of course painted accordingly. Over the next few weeks, months, I will be getting some transfers for number plates for the vehicles. So a lot of the vehicles I've repainted are in need of a nice number plate. For the time being, I've just used a paint pen and put a yellow or white rectangle on the vehicles just so they look convincing from a distance. That concludes the vehicles. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea. Some people, just not interested at all. But I think it's important with the vehicles on a model railway. If you put all this effort into the scenery and you put all this effort into the rolling stock, trying to create, an authentic representation of what ran where with what rolling stock at what time and all that kind of stuff. If you choose to take it that far, that is. It's important to try and do the same sort of thing with your road vehicles. Moving on to rolling stock, there's a number of bits and pieces that I've been working on over the past few months, and one of those is the ballast train. You may remember in a previous layout update I mentioned that I picked up some of the Dapol turbot wagons, some of the Helian dogfish wagons, and some additional Hornby sea lion wagons. All of these wagons were vacuum or dual braked, so they could be seen running in a mixed train such as this. And as you can see, I've now completed all of the weathering and the various bits of paintwork to these wagons. At the head of the train we have this Class 37 from Bachmann. This is one of the older models now, with the new model catching a lot of attention here, there and everywhere. They've not yet announced any liveries in the new guise of 37 that I am interested in. So at the moment I'm quite happy with the old ones that I've got. This particular one I rebodied a few months ago, and as you can see it's now working for the engineers, and it's finished in the rather drab civil engineers grey livery. This particular loco was seen in the region that I model, which is one of the reasons why I chose this body shell. And as you can see, currently it's still pristine and needs weathering. So that's on the list, and I might get that done over the next couple of months. So the train itself is a mixture of different wagons, and I really like it. It's a nice bit of variety for the layout with a mixed train like that running through. I really like Engineers Workings and Speedlink, as you can have a lot of different wagon types in the same train. So these hoppers here are the Hornby Sea Lion wagon. These are similar standard of tooling to the Sea Cow wagon that they also offer. Both wagons, to all intents and purposes, look the same, but the Sea Lion is a riveted construction. You can see all of the rivets on the body of the hopper just there, whereas the Sea Cow is welded, so none of those rivets are visible, with the wagon being welded together instead. I really like the Sea Cow. I really like the detail on it. I think Hornby have done a nice job of it, and it's just a pity that they don't really put it in their catalogue all that often. All of the examples on Everard Junction are second-hand examples, as I cannot remember the last time they actually put this in their main range and offered it for sale. Occasionally the Sea Cow gets a trip out and they make a batch of those, but I think it's been a while since those as well, so I'm not entirely sure what's going on there, but this is a really nice wagon, and I think they could probably sell quite a few of them if they actually made some. Behind that we have a pair of Dapol turbot wagons. These are a very nice model, very fine detail, very intricate. Slight error with the livery in terms of the engineer's yellow is a little bit too zingy, a bit too lemony in colour. I've attempted to tone that down with some weathering, but it does still show up. But I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. I've got 4 different running numbers of these wagons, and that's one of the nice things with Dapol is they do regularly produce the models in their catalogue. You get regular production runs of various models, so you can, over the course of a year or two, you can build up a train quite quickly with all unique numbered vehicles, rather than just buying 13 of the same exact wagon. As you can see, I've given these quite a heavy weathering using various techniques, weathering powders, airbrushing, washes using Tamiya panel line wash, and a few oil paints and things here and there to create some of the sort of rusting and damage on the body of the wagon. These things were quite fragile in real life, and they really did get beaten about and abused by the engineers on British Rail, and it didn't take very long before they looked in a right state. So using pictures as inspiration, I've done my best to sort of portray some sort of used and abused turbot wagons, but once again I've not gone too overboard with the weathering, although there were examples of it, as I like the appearance of the wagon, and all the printed detail and stuff is really nice to see, so I've sort of tried to strike a nice balance with that. Here we have some of the Hellian dogfish wagons, similar to the Hornby Sea Lion wagon. These do not see a production run very often and can go for quite a lot of money. I found a rake of 5 of these for sale relatively cheaply. I think I paid about £100 for 5 of them, and that is considered relatively cheap for these by today's standards. And the reason they were relatively cheap is because the weathering was, shall we say, not great. Somebody had attempted to weather them to their own taste, and well, I'll be kind and say it certainly wasn't to my taste. So I stripped all of the weathering off of the wagons, and I also repainted 2 of them into the sort of olive sort of colour. But certainly on these wagons, by the time my layout is set, the olive colour had completely disappeared and they were just rust coloured. So that's what I've done there. You can see there's various patches of red oxide primer and black paint and bits and pieces here and there. I've also added all of the appropriate transfers, of course, during the course of the repaint. So I've kept one of these wagons aside with the poor weathering, and I'll be filming a tutorial over the next month or two with regards to taking that weathering back and tailoring the wagon to my needs. These wagons are fitted with KD couplers, and that is something the previous owner did. They converted them over, and I've not had any problems with them. They seem to work absolutely fine. Personally, I'm a big fan of KD couplers. They might not look 100% accurate for British layouts, but they work well. Staying with the rolling stock theme, we'll take a look at a new arrival to the layout. And here we have it. This is one of the new Bachmann Class 47s, and this particular one is 47526. 526 was a 47 that got transferred to the Western region in the late 80s, early 90s, around that sort of time period, which is what I model. And as you can see, it looks a right mess, but it's really well done. It's probably the best factory weathering I have ever seen from a major manufacturer. I've looked at lots of photographs of this locomotive, and Bachmann really have to be commended for the job they've done for the weathering. I would really struggle personally to achieve this level of finish with regards to the peeling and faded paint, particularly on the blue, and even subtle details like the outline of the previous nameplate that it used to carry is shown. Now, while it can look a bit much, 526 very much looked like this in 1990 and 1991 as it worked around the Western region, hauling various Network Southeast services, and even certain bits of the weathering, bits of paint that have been touched up and bits of specific weathering have been faithfully modelled by Bachmann on this example. They really have done a nice job. Of course, I have fitted all of the extra pipework and detailing to the front of the loco, and it was really nice to see that all of this stuff was weathered. Even though it's included in a separate detailing bag, it was all weathered, so I was just able to simply glue it into position. I didn't have to try and blend it in to the factory weathered finish. Other nice details such as the white marks on the wheels and the chips in the paint on the lower body side going down to the primer are all present. The roof weathering is also nicely picked out with different levels of grime around the various details, and certain flat surfaces are much cleaner than areas of sort of vents and edges and seam lines and things like that. It's a nice job, and not just some airbrushed filth that you often see with factory weathering on some models. I've fitted a driver to this example. As I've mentioned previously, the new 47s don't come with a driver fitted anymore. That's something the older model used to have, and a nice touch, I think, personally. But anyway, they don't come with one anymore, so when I took the body off to put a decoder in it, I have fitted a driver just lying around in my collection, nothing special, and he just happened to fit in the chair, so that's the one I used. I've painted him in a British Rail shirt with a blue tie. This will be my second new generation Bachmann Class 47 and my third locomotive for 2022. And as per the other 47 that I purchased, really pleased with this one. It runs superbly, it looks the part. I didn't have to do any weathering or anything to it, so I saved many hours of work in that respect. It literally was just plug and play straight onto the layout. I was a little bit worried about buying this model. You know, it's not cheap, and at the time some of the other 47s from a similar batch, albeit in different colours, had a couple of quality issues, things like bent aerials, chips in the paint and things like that, and several people were playing sort of table tennis with their retailers with sending models that were not up to standard back to the shop only to receive a model back that was better in some areas, but it still had a bent aerial, it had a chip here or chip there. So I was a bit worried about purchasing it. I don't have the luxury of living anywhere near a local model shop, so it's always a bit of a risk for me because I just have to get everything mail order. So thanks to Dave over at Dean Park Station, I contacted Dave, and he happened to be taking a visit to Scenic Hobbies over in Kirkcaldy, Scotland, and they had one of these models in absolutely perfect condition, and it was great for Dave and Scenic Hobbies to cast their eye over it before sending it on to me. So I got an absolutely perfect example, and I'm really pleased with it. Again, I was worried because this is such an intricate weathering finish. Any damage to the paintwork or imperfections in the process that has been used to create this, I would struggle to touch up myself. And while I typically do just fix stuff if it's not right when it turns up, this one for me, I just wanted to be right from the box. While I've been filming this, another parcel has arrived, and this marks a major arrival to the layout. I've been waiting for this for 7 years. Daypol first announced the Class 59 in 2015, and I remember reading that press release with anticipation and excitement, as it was a key locomotive for the original Everard Junction layout that no longer exists. Considering EMD designed, manufactured, shipped and put into service the original Class 59s in 3 years, and it's taken us over 7 to get a model, it is a little bit laughable, and certainly over the last couple of years this model has been the butt of several jokes, with many modelers, including myself, refusing to believe that it actually exists. I'm just pleased to have finally taken delivery of the thing. It does look nice, it's well finished, it's got a lot of nice detail on it, and it certainly runs superbly well. I'm currently in the process of working through a number of fixes and improvements to this model, as it's certainly not perfect. While it's nice and I'm pleased with it, it's not perfect, and there's various things that should be improved upon, and considering how long it took to get it to market, you would have hoped that perhaps some of those had got sorted out. But this is what we have. Same with the Helian Class 45, I'm just going to get on with it and make some improvements of my own. I might not necessarily be able to fix everything, but we'll give it a flipping good go, and I'll dedicate that work to a video of its own. So that concludes this update. Hopefully you enjoyed it, perhaps picked up a few ideas, hints and tips. Obviously there's a lot of things I'm always working on in the background on the layout, and I don't necessarily film all of that stuff, as it is generally just nice to, relax without the camera and enjoy the hobby for what it is. So I do these sort of updates sort of every quarter or so, just to bring you up to speed on the little bits and pieces that I've been working on off camera. Also a bit exceptional in this video to have 2 new arrivals to the layout. As I've mentioned previously, I don't tend to buy a massive amount of locomotives or rolling stock throughout the course of the year for the layout. I've been collecting slowly for a long time over the course of many years, and I try and stick quite closely to the era and the region that I model. However, having said that, I've been waiting for this for 7 years, so let's indulge in a little bit of a running session and we'll get this Class 59 and the new Class 47 that I've picked up running together, and I'll be back as soon as I can, obviously, in the next video when I've made enough progress on the next project, which might well be this Class 59, or it could be some scenery, or maybe some weathering on those Helian dogfish wagons. So we'll see what happens.